of course you can call me Daddy. And if you want to follow me on Facebook, you can find me at james.desborough, Postmortem Studios, all one word, JD Writer and JGD Games. Hello lovelies. Now, I'm not particularly enamoured of chasing controversy for clout. I just talk about things that interest me, and quite often those are things that other people find controversial or offensive or whatever, but that's on them, not on me. So I am going to talk about the whole Orcs are people too controversy, which has blown up yet again. This is not the first time on Twitter, but quickly first, if you'll indulge me, a little housekeeping. I have a shit ton of work to do. I've got some freelancing that's come in, I've got some video editing that's come in, I've got some copy editing that's come in. I can't afford to leave it on the table, but if I work according to my regular schedule, I'm not going to be able to do it all. I also have layout and editing and additions for 2 gore adventures and some other work. What I'm saying is there's a lot going on, so don't expect many, if any, videos this week. I might just do some quick vlogging type things just to keep the channel ticking over, but otherwise not. So yeah, don't expect many or any videos this week. Hopefully back to normal next week. I will, however, still be running Dragon Warriors for the foreseeable in the future over on Grim Streams, so go check me out there and subscribe. Right then, Orcs. Almost as predictable as edition wars are arguments over morality and the nature of monsters within role-playing games, and typically, almost always, this centres around goblins and orcs. So this argument that has blown up on Twitter with people accusing orcs of somehow being racist, or the approach in games of somehow being racist towards orcs, it's not new. Been watching this go on since the 80s, I suppose, though really since the 90s. It is nothing new.
Oh dear, how pathetic. Yes, I anticipated that.
It used to take the form of the question, is it moral to kill baby goblins or baby orcs or whatever else the case might be? And it turns out that the answer, at least within your bog standard out of the box D&D game world, with all the implications that come with that, which we will get into, the answer is yes, because these are irredeemably evil creatures in a world that has objective, genuine morality, and good and evil are not vague relative terms, but rather they are something concrete and meaningful. So this is not a new argument by any stretch of the imagination, but the context is different because we've had 30 years or so of relatively humanized monsters in role-playing games and in computer games that deal with role-playing elements, such as, for example, Skyrim or World of Warcraft. I put a lot of blame on World of Warcraft because it kind of Disneyfied orcs and led to the creation of a hell of a lot of orc porn, and most people don't generally want to beat it or flick it to something that is intrinsically and inherently evil and will as happily eat your face as fuck you. There are always exceptions, of course. So this isn't anything new whatsoever. And, you know, I've got a lot of gaming experience, a lot of experience arguing these things, a lot of experience creating fictional worlds, and in all of this. So I think I'm in a pretty qualified place, if that's the kind of thing that bothers you, to talk about this, both within a literary context, a mytho-historical context, and specifically a role-playing context. So let's go. It's important to understand the context here, and I wasted some of my education on communication studies and history, in which you learn very much to address the context, the communication that's intended, the communication that's received, the medium that it passes through, all that kind of thing. Not terribly useful, really, immunised me a little bit against advertising, but actually kind of useful here. Now, the presupposition that the interlopers, the cuckoos, the critics are working from is that everything is racist. Otherwise, you are sexist, racist, homophobic,
fascist,
and all the rest of it. Now, I know that Sarkeesian quote is her actually pointing out how annoying that kind of thing is in a rare moment of fleeting self-awareness, but it's an avatar of everything that's wrong here. The assumption of other people's motives, the impugning of those motives, pretending that they don't know what they're talking about when they do something, or what their intention is. Holding someone accountable for a subjective effect that something they do or say has upon you that isn't intended that way. It's not right.
Now, this really pisses me off to no end.
They're also operating from, well, the same relationship with the real world that I have, largely. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in gods. I don't believe in objective morality. I very much embrace the idea of moral relativism up to a point. I think there are things that we can say as a species that work better for everyone's health, happiness, and well-being than others, but that's not an objective morality. That's as close as you can get to objective morality in human beings. Yeah, I'm not a creationist. I don't believe in a god. I believe in equality and fairness and all the rest of the things that these people also think, but they're applying it to a fictional context and a fictional world that does not have the same physics or metaphysics or relationships or underpinning reality that our reality does. And it's a shame to see people enter into an imaginative hobby and then render themselves completely unable to consider different worlds, different moralities, different modes of thought, different ways of being and doing, and so on. Now, when it comes specifically to D&D and orcs, at least within the sort of standard default setting, what we have is a world with objective morality. Good and evil and law and chaos and even neutrality are not abstract relative concepts. They are real, concrete things that exist on planes and in the real world. Your decision, your alignment, it can shift according to what you do. If you do evil acts, you become evil and you become vulnerable to spells that affect evil people, or can use artifacts that are only usable by people who are evil. Yeah, these aren't the same wishy-washy terms that exist in reality, where culture and context and situation and so on can affect morality. No, these are hard and fast metaphysical truths, at least within your standard D&D world.
We are philosophers.
Though we may not be.
Yes, we are!
Also, in your standard D&D world, gods are real. They're not an abstract concept. They do not require faith in order for you to believe in them. They are real, they manifest, they grant magical power, they create species, races in in-game terminology, and they act in the world, and they do things, and they direct their followers. And going on from that, creationism in these fantasy realms is real. Races, beings, species are created by gods or magic or whatever else for a purpose. They have an intrinsic God-given purpose and alignment and nature and being. And in that context, in that world, orcs, in that sense, are objectively evil, and they cannot be anything else. They've not been given the same gift of free will that humans and other self-aware species have. They might be self-aware, but they have been created by evil deities for evil purposes to do evil things in the real world. They have no choice, nor would they want to exercise that choice. They live to be evil, and this is reinforced by their culture as well as being intrinsic within them. So once you take those presuppositions, that objective morality exists, that gods are real, that creationism is real within this fantasy context, there is no path to redemption for an orc, or at least it's massively unusual and unlikely and would largely be limited to player characters or powerful NPCs. A lot of people get sidelined by the term race within games, but it's necessary to remind people that race and species were once synonyms. You run into this a lot arguing with creationists. They look at very old books about evolution and Darwin's use of the term race, and they interpret that to mean racism.
In these enlightened days, of course, no one believes a word of it.
I'm sorry, but I don't believe a word of it.
They determine that to mean human races, when we're only one race, the human race, rather than species, which is what it used to mean. So even if we take a more scientific, or at least plausibly realistic approach, orcs are not humans with green skin. They are a separate species. They are as fundamentally different to us as human beings as we are to chimpanzees or gorillas or orangutans or...
Earthmen are not proud of their ancestors and never invite them round to dinner.
Even further afield, if you want to go, sharks. if you scaled up an ichneumon wasp to human size and gave it intelligence, yeah, moral relativism is all well and good, but once that thing is laying its larvae in your belly and they're devouring you from the inside, I tend to imagine that most people's moral relativism would get the old heave-ho. It becomes kind of redundant. Male lions, when they take over a pride, very often kill all the cubs that were birthed from the previous male that haven't yet grown to full size. Make lions intelligent, scale them up to human size. Would their morality around children, multiple marriages, all the rest of it, would that likely be the same as humans, especially since they're obligate carnivores? You could not have a vegan lion. Even if we ignore all that metaphysical stuff, the species differences, genetic differences, instincts, and so on, even if you make a non-human creature intelligent, are likely to be extremely different and alien and even to seem evil from a human perspective. I mean, as far as that ichneumon wasp is concerned, it's just providing a nice warm home for its young, right? So it's a good and moral and proper thing to do to place them within a living host. As far as the lion's concerned, it's perpetuating its genes and clearing out the genes of its rival. And that's a good and moral and proper thing to do, right? And we're not so immune to these instincts as we might think. As humans, we're just used to them, and we see everything from our perspective. But from that human perspective, both mass child slaughter and sacrificing someone else's life to raise our young can seem a bit off, a bit evil. So the long and the short of it is that orcs generally aren't a race, but they're a species, and they're a non-human species, and there is no reason whatsoever that such a non-human species should have anything even slightly resembling human morality. And they're a species within a metaphysical, magical, and divine context that is utterly unlike the real world, and has much more in common with old medieval religious concepts of the world. That good and evil were identifiable, quantifiable, set, defined things. You could be evil, that you could be good. Nothing like the real world. As far as modern fantasy writing and films and games and so on go, the origin of the orc, though the word is older, is really Tolkien. And Tolkien was drawing on pre-Christian mythology, such as the Fomorians, goblins, trolls, and so on, from Celtic, Pictish, Scandinavian, and Finno-Ugric myths. Now, in those myths, these beings are often possessed of a purpose of cruelty and destruction and maliciousness, from Fomorian tear drinkers who would torture humans in order to drink their tears, to malicious sprites, bogles, kelpies, things that would drown you for no other reason than they would, and all sorts of other nastiness. And Tolkien drew on that, particularly in terms of the elven languages and Finnish, for example, But his interpretation of orcs is much more grounded in Judeo-Christian mythology, and I think his World War I experiences. And remember that the book didn't come out till post-World War II, so impugning Tolkien with a great deal of racism is projecting something that almost certainly wasn't really there. Of course, he grew up in a British imperial context, of course, and language was different and perhaps less sensitive to these issues then, but still, to assume and to place it on him is a rather unethical behaviour. And many people look at his correspondence and so on with a more modern, jaundiced and frankly blinkered eye. A lot of people examine these things through lenses, like a feminist cultural lens or a race issues cultural lens, which is basically just Funhouse mirror distorting everything, because if you go looking for anything, you're going to find what you go looking for simply because of pareidolia, if nothing else.
We don't demand solid facts. What we demand is a total absence of solid facts.
Tolkien's orcs, their history does tap into that Judeo-Christian idea. If you read the background, the Silmarillion and the rest of it, to the Lord of the Rings, orcs are created or twisted as a mockery of or from elves. And in the background of Tolkien's work, in the history of Tolkien's work, elves and other beings are a lot more powerful, more like angels and demons, and this goes for dragons and balrogs and other things as well. By the time you get to the age of the Lord of the Rings, everything is much diminished and weakened. So orcs in that sense are more like fallen angels, they're more like demons than anything else, created either by the corruption and usurpation of elves, or deliberately created by dark gods and beings to do their bidding, and they become debased and weaker as time goes on and become something else, something more like a commentary from Tolkien on inhumanity and industrialization. This is a man who's been through World War I, the advent of the machine gun, artillery in massive widespread use in this particular way, gas weapons and so on, the obsession with fire and explosives and machinery that we see in the orcs is a reflection of, I believe, the industrial nature of war, which obviously had a huge impact on Tolkien and a lot of other people of his time, of his age, people who served. And then World War II only impacted that even further and showed the true repugnance of genuine and actual racism. So impugning him as a racist is frankly disgusting.
Isn't that rather unethical behaviour?
Oh, is it? I'm afraid I'm a bit out of touch.
And that kind of industrial, corrupt, overpowered and misled interpretation of orcs is also seen in another huge intellectual property that we see relating to orcs, second probably only to Tolkien, and then maybe with Warcraft coming third, but derived from this. And that's Games Workshop's orcs, which were based on English football hooligans. Which means, according to the same sort of philosophy that a lot of these cuckoos and usurpers have, if we depict orcs as a criticism of football hooligans who are white and therefore apparently privileged and racist themselves, and boisterous and crude and stupid, then that cannot be racism.
It gives me a headache just trying to think down to your level.
And that is a huge strand of the modern understanding of the orc, which has been hugely influential in its turn on Warcraft and so on. Of course, this is a redefinition of racism. Of course you can be racist towards English people, but you know what? If you're doing it through orcs, you have my permission. This shouldn't need explanation, but orcs don't real. They're not real. They don't exist. It's not a real race. It's not a real species. It's not a real people. They can't be oppressed. They have nothing whatsoever to do with race relations in the real world or whatever else. It's fiction. Fiction is a tool for exploring what-ifs. So what if we did share the world with other sentient humanoids that weren't human and had very different instincts and moralities and so on as us. So what if gods were real? What if good and evil were not subjective relative concepts? What if they were concrete and absolute and had real and definite meaning? What if something or someone could be born intrinsically evil?
Yeah, and so what?
From our point of view, at least, not damaged, not mentally impaired, but naturally evil. What if? What if, for example, we'd gone to colonize the United States and it was full of cannibalistic, inhuman monsters such as found in Bone Tomahawk? What if we were invaded by an inherently cruel race like the Cro-Mags in Sliders? What if we encountered a tribe that took advantage of our attempts at moral relativism and understanding, as happens in Green Inferno? What happens? What if? What if this, that, the other were real or true? And like I said, I'm an atheist. I can set that aside for a game and have gods be real in a game. I am a moral relativist, but I can set that aside in a game if its metaphysics call for it. This idea, orcs are people too. This was a challenging and interesting thing when it first happened about 30 years ago, because up until that point, the prevailing unquestioned attitude in games was that orcs were just a limitless supply of experience points, and there were no moral qualms whatsoever in games about killing evil creatures. So to encounter well-rounded, tribal, societal orcs with genuine feelings and all the rest of it, this was challenging and interesting and part of that whole artistic movement in RPGs throughout the 90s. Now it's a tired, played out and worn out cliche, and now it's people's expectation, even in games where it is not and never has been the case, such as D&D. It doesn't challenge you. It doesn't make you think.
You mean you can see into my mind?
Yes.
And?
It amazes me how you manage to live in anything that small.
Whereas if we treat orcs and other evil-aligned monsters as irredeemably evil, that does challenge the status quo and our thinking. It is now a more interesting what if to go back and examine the idea of intrinsic and absolute, irredeemable, immutable evil. And this is part of the reason Goblin Slayer has been so effective and powerful and interesting and different, because it has taken modern aesthetics and so on and gone back to the roots. This is why the OSR in many ways is so powerful, because it takes modern aesthetics, expertise, expectations and experience and takes them back to that basic experience of playing D&D. And then you get all kinds of interesting and new and different things out of it. Not entirely my personal cup of tea, but I can recognise when something interesting is happening. There are similar stories that have tackled this idea. The Cro-Mags, the cannibals in Bone Tomahawk, like I said, the tribe in Green Inferno, evil kids horror. There's been a boom in sort of evil spirits that just dick with people for the sake of it in a lot of films and so on, particularly found footage type of stuff. It is more interesting to challenge and question that super tolerant attitude, to see what the limits of moral relativism are by having things that irredeemably and that are irredeemably and immutably evil within a game, and to see how people play with that, because that's no longer what they expect, and that's what makes the story interesting. I mean, Star Trek is kind of the prototypically proto-woke show, right? And even when they went dark in DS9, all of those Trek underpinnings were still there, which is why DS9 worked so well as a counterpoint, whereas Discovery and so on don't work so well, because they're no longer rooted and grounded in that morality, even if they're questioning it. That humanist, we just need to understand and accept everyone sort of culture. DS9 challenged that, and that's what made it so effective and so powerful as a series and as a conveyance for storytelling. And there's a story in that does the kind of thing that I'm talking about, even though it's manifestly unusual in Star Trek. And that's the story with the baby Jem'Hadar in The Abandoned, Now, Star Trek is built on these presumptions that we all have about real-world morality and our aspirations when it comes to morality, and it became a nature versus nurture argument. The Jem'Hadar are genetically engineered soldiers that are indoctrinated from the genetic level, pretty much, and hooked on a drug, yeah, and designed to be aggressive warriors. And the crew of DS9 tried to raise this thing in a culture that was different, but its nature could not be overcome because it was so engineered and needed this chemical so much, Ketracel White. And that was such a powerful and meaningful story because it went counter to everything we would normally expect from Trek, at least old Trek. But now that's the status quo. And so challenging that, just as it was powerful in DS9, is incredibly powerful. We're at the point where we're so saturated in the Orcs are people too attitude that the original stories of Tolkien and others that were using non-human races as metaphors and analogies, even as early Trek did, if you will, they land poorly to people who seem incapable of comprehending nuance, or of taking anything but the worst take on anything, not understanding metaphor or analogy, or have trained themselves to see bigotry even where it doesn't exist.
Isn't that rather unethical behaviour?
Oh, is it? I'm afraid I'm a bit out of touch.
And they will not even tolerate even the slightest pushback or explanation or provision of context, or even the idea that these worlds have different metaphysics. They'll just call you names.
Fascist!
It's not sustainable. Orcs aren't racist. You can't be racist towards an orc. There are no orcs to be racist towards. This whole idea of making orcs people too and making people's attitude to them prejudice, that was a novel, new, shiny, interesting idea in the 90s. These days, not so much, because that's pretty much our status quo. It's now more interesting to examine them as monsters. But all of this is kind of pointless anyway. RPGs are, by definition, a hobby, not a brand. Right? You don't have to hove to the material that you're given one way or the other. You can make each and every game your own. And if everyone kind of stuck to that and framed these things as discussions, then there wouldn't be a problem at all. But no, cuckoos have got to come in and say, this is racist, it's always been racist, anyone who does it this way is racist.
Son of a bitch must pay.
Yeah, understandably gets people's backs up. If you say you don't like it, you believe it to be racist, so you're not going to have it in your game, you get a little bit of pushback, but not a great deal. People might make fun of you, whatever. It is a kind of outre, kind of stupid idea, and shows a lack of understanding of context and mythology and history and everything else here. It's a deeply biased and warped viewpoint.
I still don't believe you. Why not? You tend to lie a lot. Hey.
But if you kind of just, you do you, boo, and it wouldn't be a problem. But you can't do that. You have to, I'm sorry to use the phrase, but you have to virtue signal by doing everybody else down and insisting that they're racist and wrong and they've been doing it wrong for ages, and telling them what they think and what they feel and why, and putting the most negative possible spin, again with no regard to history or context or mythology or anything else. That is what pisses people off. That's why you get such a strong pushback. And dismissing the community as toxic because it pushes back at you for being an annoying knobchops.
A bunch of mindless jerks who'll be the first against the wall when the revolution comes.
That's not toxic behaviour, that's people defending their hobby and their friends and each other and their favourite creators against an outsider trying to usurp it and change it and tell them they're bad people when they know they're not, and they know that the creators they like are not for the most part, and so on and so on and so on. I mean, you're like one of those annoying vegans going into a knitting meeting and then upbraiding everyone for using animal wool.
Fascist!
Whether it be from sheep or alpacas or angora or whatever else. What the fuck are you doing here? Who said you could come in and tell us all off and accuse us of God knows what.
A minute, I'm a reasonable guy, but I've just experienced some very unreasonable things.
We're here to knit. You know, and here we're here to play. We're here to explore fictive realities that don't necessarily relate to our own. Alien mindsets, you know, alien physics and metaphysics, magic and religion and societies that have nothing to do with the real world, or sometimes derived from history, because we want to explore that history. And then you come in, dick all that up, and then act surprised, mercy, when people call you on it.
Bring me the boar worms.
Do it in a way that's not being a dick and not calling people things, and you might get away with it. Worth a thought. Because we don't have to follow what you say, you don't have to follow what we say, but you could do it without the judgment and without ballooning everything into some absurd cosmic scale problem every time, because it's really not. Make your game your own, you do you, fuck off and make your own shit. Zang. Postmortem Studios sells a wide variety of stock art, well over 500 pieces, many of them by RPG industry veteran Brad McDevitt. These are available for you to use in your personal or professional projects, whether stories or games or anything else. Check us out at rpgnow.com.